Welcome to our very first webinar series of the new year, 2023-2024, University Confidential, How Faculty Members Engage in Sense-Making and Social Capital and Role Conflict Among Deans. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. We invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside by clicking on https://nativeland.ca. As we invite you to participate in the webinars today, to engage in conversation, I wish to indicate a few notes here. Zoom has generated closed captioning for accessibility available as a live transcript. During the Q&A session at the end, we'll have half an hour for questions. Please save your questions. They should be entered through the Q&A option, and we will be addressing the questions after the initial discussion. Please note that your name and question will be visible to all attendees, and you also can upvote using an indicator there to the top of the list if you see a question that you also would like to ask. Scroll your cursor towards the bottom of the screen to use these functions in the toolbar. So for today's presentations, we're very excited and very grateful to welcome both of our presenters today. We have Emerson LaCroix from the University of Waterloo, who's going to be presenting on Making Sense of Experiential Education, the 4 lenses of faculty sense-making. The second presenter will be Dr. David Manzuk, Dean Emeritus from the University of Manitoba, who will be presenting Janice Lives, Social Capital and Role Conflict Among Deans at a large Canadian university. I would like to welcome Emerson LaCroix to begin our first presenter. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Elena, for your introduction. And I'm excited to be presenting today at the first webinar. I always love attending these. Today, I'm going to be presenting some research that is from my doctoral dissertation on experiential education. This project is supported by a SSHRC doctoral scholarship. And what I'm going to be presenting on today is faculty sense-making and experiential education. So experiential education, it's a growing phenomenon in the university education broadly. It's defined, quite generally as a pedagogical philosophy that blends classroom learning with external experiences. And importantly, it also involves purposeful reflection. So maybe you've seen something like the Kolb model of experiential education. This is what we're sort of talking about here. And institutions also have their own definitions for experiential education. It's particularly valued for equipping post-secondary students with enhanced curricular learning outcomes. And there's also empirical evidence suggesting that particular forms of experiential education, such as work-integrated learning, have enhanced benefits on the job market. So there's labor market returns for this as well. When looking at the literature on experiential education, though, much of it is, it might be written by faculty. Maybe they talk about implementation studies. They're published in either specific journals or journals oriented towards teaching in their disciplines. And while this is excellent, the sort of piece that I thought was missing of this was, but how do faculty themselves make sense of experiential education? This is an important understanding because from an organizational standpoint, faculty are the actors who are tasked with the teaching, research, and service functions of universities. And if experiential education is expanding in scope and indeed requirements, in Ontario, for example, it's a new strategic funding metric. This begs the question about how this plays out within organizations or within universities. So What I'm doing is tacking down to faculty sense-making using a qualitative term. This is going to be the units of analysis driving this study. It's important to understand because institutional change can impact what it means to be an academic. And as Qualters notes, different constituents across the university will all have burning questions about what experiential education means for them and the realms that they inhabit. So this leads me to two questions. The first is, how do faculty make sense of experiential education? And to what extent has experiential education impacted their perceptions of their own professional roles? So I'm coming at this from an organizational standpoint, right? Using organizational type thinking as opposed to pedagogical thinking. To give you a little bit of background on the theoretical context of what actually is sense-making. So I have this slide prepared that sense-making is a process that occurs when surprising or discrepant cues interrupt individuals' ongoing activities. And they retrospectively develop plausible meanings of those cues that rationalize what they've been doing. So in less obtuse terms, this is essentially, so there's a discrepant cue. So you can sort of think of this as, they can take the form of crises. So for example, everyone probably immediately thinks COVID-19, right? That was a crisis that interrupted your personal and professional routines, your sense of being within your role and your university or wherever you work. In less dramatic instances, this can essentially be where individuals don't have the stock of knowledge that's needed to solve a problem. So the general idea with sense making is that actors either don't have the knowledge they need to address a problem, or they have to sort of take a step back and think about existing stocks of knowledge they have to commonly answer a question, what's going on here? So what's going on with respect to experiential education? I wanted to come at this a little bit more systematically, right? So a lot of literature has, one-off implementation type studies. Maybe they talk about a discipline a little bit more broadly, but there hasn't been sort of a systematic investigation of experiential education. So what I did, this research is situated in Ontario. So I used the Maclean's university rankings to sort of divvy up 6 institutions, 6 universities in the province, 2 undergraduate, 2 comprehensive, and 2 doctoral. And to make comparisons between those, I created a sample of 4 humanities and social sciences and 4 STEM-based disciplines, so that across these institutions, you could get institutional nuance. Is something happening at doctoral that isn't happening at undergraduate? As well as how there might be disciplinary nuance between how does someone from an English background think of experiential learning compared to math and statistics. So overall, that gave me a sampling frame of 1,384 faculty members. I reached out through a letter of information and survey. So the survey, they could opt in at the end to a semi-structured interview with me. Today, I'm just reporting on the interview findings. Though I reached out to everyone twice, unless I heard back immediately that they didn't want to be contacted again. So that the total engagement is around probably just north of 2,500 engagements. Though you'll notice on the bottom right-hand side, this yields a sample of 47. So it really highlights how wide of a net you have to cast for qualitative research. Most interviews came from humanities and social science disciplines. So it was around 35 participants rather than STEM-based disciplines, which was 12. Of the 47, 33 were tenured or tenured track, and 14 were non-tenured. And I won't get into the analytic procedure for the purposes of this presentation, but the transcripts were imported into in vivo. They went through several rounds of inductive coding, and finally a process of theoretically driven coding given the core propositions of sense making that I draw on in the broader project. So the findings are essentially that faculty don't make sense of experiential education along monolithic lines. What I mean by that is they have distinct frames of reference that are interwoven but not mutually exclusive. And they draw on these frames as what I'm calling sources of sense. So the imagery that I think that might be helpful is a kaleidoscope, right? So looking down the barrel at experiential education, If you turn the kaleidoscope, you'll get a different picture of experiential education. So that was sort of my metaphorical thinking of, well, if we turn it this way through this line of thinking, we see this with respect to experiential education. If we turn a little bit differently, we have a different picture of it. So faculty, when they were talking about experiential education, spoke, overall, but through analysis, through the coding, it became apparent that there were different lines that they were commonly drawing on, different lines of thinking, what I'm calling the lenses of sense-making for this project. These included the disciplinary lens, the institutional lens, the pedagogical lens, and the professional lens. So it wasn't as if they sort of paused and said, well, from an institutional standpoint, I'm wearing this hat, and from a professional standpoint, I'm wearing this hat. They spoke about these, but through an inductive analytic process, these are the findings that I tease out. So I'm going to talk about these a little bit in their own terms. So the disciplinary lens was where faculty made sense of experiential education in reference to the existing stock of knowledge that they had conditioned by their discipline. So from a disciplinary standpoint, this is what I'm thinking about. These stocks of knowledge were their ways of being that had been habitualized over time as professionals working within a particular discipline. For some, this meant considering where experiential education fits within their discipline as it was. And others made sense of experiential education in relation to ongoing discussions on the state of the discipline. So as I have in the first quote here, it's just an increasing expectation that we're doing this in our subject field. One sociologist likened these transitions to an in-between situation where the foundational values of studying, learning, and critical thinking were important, but acknowledged we also want our students to have jobs. The disciplinary considerations showcase that conceptualizing experiential education is ongoing work across many academic disciplines, and this is in no way settled terrain. The disciplinary lens was used by faculty to recombine messages and meanings of experiential education that they were aware of with their existing stocks of knowledge as disciplinary actors. So they were still trying to figure out experiential education. Even those who were active users talked about this. The institutional lens was all about faculty interpreting experiential education in relation to their institutional environment. So in the context of Ontario, universities inhabit an institutional environment of higher education. And as I talked about earlier, experiential education is a new funding metric that's being doled out. So they talked about the institutional norms about how higher education should be done. And commonly, this led to sort of two questions that faculty sort of thought about and mused about themselves, which was, how is experiential education being mechanized within their own university? And how sincerely are universities fostering it? So many participants acknowledged the ways their universities were communicating experiential education. Oftentimes, this came down to maybe strategic planning documents they were aware of, institutional websites, maybe email listservs, the occasional newsletter. And it's important to underscore that faculty in this study were generally supportive of experiential education. As I said, many were, or as I will say in a minute, many were active users of experiential education. So they had a positive view of it. Their concerns were about this idea of authenticity, how authentically their universities were embracing it. So some discussed it more as a branding tool, right? And merely institutional lip service to satisfy these pressures within their field, such as the funding metrics. To me, from an organizational standpoint, it seemed like evidence of a ceremonial effort to imbue experiential education with legitimacy without meaningfully translating this to core level changes, such as resourcing. Some talked about, the fact that, this is so hard, it takes so much effort and time to do, and it's not really rewarded by my institution. So I have little buy-in to do this institutionally. So it sparked concerns over the ways in which experiential education was being commodified, potentially as a branding tool, rather than in alignment with its pedagogical value. So that's what I sort of have here on the screen, the sociologist musing about this, about on the one side, they feel they incorporate it to how they think about pedagogy just naturally, but on the flip side, they're concerned about, is this just being institutionalized and commodified? Is it a new commodity within higher education that we're just doing this without meaningful pedagogical or institutional foundations. So this slide, the pedagogical lens is really about the alignment that instructors felt between experiential education and their own pedagogical philosophy, their own pedagogical values. As I said, many were active users. So about 36 of the 47 were active users looking to instill concrete skills and knowledge. So the curricular benefits to student learning, was what they were thinking about. So as the first quote I have here, insofar as it's part of their overall teaching philosophy, they want their students to leave with a skill, something they could take to their other courses, right? So this idea of the benefit for their learning in that course, but also for their future growth and learning. Some were always active users. They just said, nope, I've always done it this way, irregardless of what's happening at the institution level. I've always taught this way. And others reflected on having to find their own way with experiential education. In particular, some were at the end point of their career and reflected on the evolution of their pedagogical training. I thought the second quote here is quite poignant. Like, I'm from a generation where there's no pedagogical training. You got your doctorate and then you just jumped in, and the assumption was you have the PhD so you can teach, right? Others expressed, interestingly, sound pedagogical reasons for not using. So this is very exciting for me because there's not a lot of findings about why people aren't using experiential education. So the flip side of the equation, right? Important to tease this out. There are many reasons that faculty chose not to use experiential education or acknowledge that it might work in this course, but not in this course. In this case, the third quote that I have here is, I can't use it in every one of my classes. It's just not possible to do that because the point of a course might be to communicate disciplinary knowledge. So while experiential education is great, there are certain situations and maybe courses that lend itself to experiential learning and others that don't. So I'm wrapping up my own course right now, Intro Sociology. I have 300 students. There is no way in the context of 12 weeks, the limited prep time as a sessional instructor, the resources that are available to me, that I could authentically do experiential education. So I took this point, I lent more on just transmission of disciplinary knowledge, and maybe in the upper years, that's when it could happen more. And so things like class sizes and resources were other reasons faculty drew on for not using experiential education. In terms of the professional lens, this really tells a mixed story of sense making for faculty members. Those with tenure, I found, felt a sense of security for warding off any expectations that experiential education be imposed on how they understand and perform their roles. Remember, this is from an organizational sense, right? Not just necessarily a pedagogical sense. So despite all of these pressures that are emanating within the institutional field, those with tenure had this kind of professional insulation to ward off any new demands on how they might be teaching their courses. And at the same time, many were also conscious that within this field of higher education, the institutional expectations to develop and implement experiential education could have adverse repercussions to those without that academic freedom and autonomy. So I think we have current stats that I've seen are about a little over 1/3 or more than 1/3 of university courses are taught by precariously employed individuals. So as this second quote here, like, this might just be one more cudgel to beat academic staff, precarious academic staff with, and they worried about the increasing academic precariat and what this pedagogical thinking might not jive with current labor market dynamics of higher education. To an extent, I did have a small proportion of participants, probably about 5, who were either sessional instructors or who had recently come off the job market. And so I did ask them, I said, this is sort of a concern that's being discussed by your tenured colleagues. What has your impression of this been? And many of them noted that when applying for tenure track positions, they noted that experiential education seemed to come up more throughout the process. And while it wouldn't be the mainstay of their job talks by any means, they did need to be able to speak to this. So one of them likened it to just knowing the academic buzzwords of the time and how they would be expected to speak to it, not necessarily they'll have to embrace it. Though this does show some change potentially about, is this coming into the way that we look to hiring instructors? So in summation, faculty made sense of experiential education through what I distilled as 4 distinct lenses. And this prismed nature of sense making allows for what I'm calling a constellation of sense to be drawn by actors to the extent that experiential education was commensurate with the existing stocks of knowledge they had in those lenses and across those lenses, right? So this process of bricolage is, combining and recombining these lenses iteratively. The findings of the study add to our understanding of organizational sense making as a process of bricolage that don't make sense in static roles. And in this study, experiential education was already a social fact of education. It's already occurring in the institutional field, and faculty were continuing to make sense of it. At the same time, we need to further tease out the different roles that faculty have and how this constellation of sense making might be further nuanced. So, some of the sessional instructors I had, they just teach the one course because they're fully employed full-time elsewhere on the university campus. Sometimes they were in actual, centers for experiential learning. So they were pulling their passion over, but also recognizing that, maybe an administrative lens could be tacked on as a new lens or further nuancing the professional lens, right? That if you have an individual who is a faculty member, but also a department chair, I know David's going to talk about the Janus-based nature of higher education. So maybe this is another element to that, where they look to within their department, but also have to look to the administrative side of experiential education. So those are some things that I'm still puzzling, that I'm looking forward to teasing out further. That's all I have to present for you today. So I appreciate your attention to the presentation, and I look forward to answering your questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Emerson, for a very interesting presentation. I think your research is very unique, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and seeing how, as you mentioned, there are a lot of interesting parallels with Dr. Manzuk's presentation. So thank you very much, Emerson. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our second presenter, Dr. David Manzuk, Dean Emeritus, who will present on Janus Lives, social capital and role conflict among deans at a large Canadian university. Thank you and welcome, David.
Thanks, Alana. I hope you can hear me. And thank you, Emerson, for a really interesting presentation. Appreciated that very much. And your questions, comments towards the end will serve as a nice segue to what I'll talk about. So I've been introduced already, so we'll begin. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the Treaty 1 territory, and that's the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I better address the elephant in the room, as it were, right from the beginning, and that is, why would you bother studying deans of all people? And so I thought I'd put that question up front. And the reason is that I think as a group, they're understudied. If you look at the literature, the roles of deans within universities are pivotal, but yet they're poorly understood. They're either treated with ambivalence, held with suspicion, or even reviled, I would say. And I've always found the species to be quite fascinating, particularly given my experience as an associate dean, acting dean, and dean over a 20-year period. So I've always found this group of people very interesting. So in this presentation, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is just the dean's role in the contemporary context, a little bit about the theoretical framework that involves social capital, the Janus effect and role conflict, a bit about background and context for the study, the research design methodology that I used, and then spend most of my time talking about the results and the implications of the results. So let's start then with the contemporary dean's role. And here I'm drawing on the work of Bonus, Melch, and Seal, who come from a variety of different countries, of different perspectives. It's clear that being a dean means that you're engaging with multiple stakeholders with incompatible expectations, whether they're students, staff, faculty, external stakeholders like accreditation agencies, government, all of those folks, all those groups have different expectations for deans, and it turns out that they're often competing with one another and they're quite incompatible. And deans are, as with other educational leaders, are working with increasing uncertainty and complexity in a time that seems to be quite volatile, and by the looks of things are not going to get any different anytime soon. So deans, when we interview them, they often refer to themselves as neither fish nor fowl. And they often say that they often find themselves betwixt and between. And when they say things like this, they really mean that they're both an academic, but they're an administrator. They're both a faculty member, but they're a member of the senior administration team in the university. So they're continually having to straddle at least two worlds. But what I'm going to show in this presentation, I hope, is that they're straddling a multiple worlds at all at the same time. And that is probably why it's increasingly challenging to recruit and retain deans, because more and more people are realizing how difficult it is to play these roles. Many people who are recruited do not finish their first terms. So that's a little bit of context to begin with. Now let's take a look at the theoretical framework that I used for the study. And we'll start with social capital, which is a common sociological term that most of you will be very familiar with. I'm drawing on the work of Bourdieu, Wilcock, and Coleman here. And I'm going to look at the three dimensions of social capital. And the first one is bonding. And bonding is what I would describe as sort of horizontal in nature. It's inward looking, involves activities of community building, connecting people of like mind. And, when you think of examples like faculty retreats, research sharing sessions, affinity groups, and even deans' daily interactions with faculty, staff, and students, they're all about bonding, about bringing people together with a common vision, common sense of where the institution is going. So that's bonding. On the other hand, the second dimension of social capital is bridging, which is horizontal in nature as well, going outwards. And it's outward looking rather than inward looking. And it's all about developing new networks to generate new perspectives, information, and resources. And some of the examples would be sort of cross-department or cross-faculty initiatives, where people who normally don't work together collaborate on new projects. Faculties working with government agencies or accreditation bodies. These are the kinds of bridging activities that broaden people's perspectives and draw them out of their own faculty department, their own discipline, to look at social life in a slightly different way. And then the third dimension of social capital, and I'm going to draw on the work of Claridge here, is known as linking. And this dimension of social capital is not as commonly found in the literature, but it's a type of vertical bridging. And by vertical, I mean up and down the institutional hierarchy, where people from the president's and the provost's office down to the caretaking staff have opportunities to interact with another, to share information, to seek feedback. But it's a way of breaking down the sort of traditional authority and power structures so that people can learn new perspectives from people who play different roles within the institution. The next part of the theoretical framework is known as the Janus effect, or Janus effect, or if you speak Latin, you would say Janus effect. And here I draw on the work of Hutmacher, Pienaar, and Cillier, and Saphir. And Janus, if you know your Roman mythology, and some of you probably know it better than I do, it was the Roman god of transitions, beginnings and endings, contradictions and extremes. And Janus was used to describe the essential paradoxes of modern life. And I felt that given that deans are expected to look forward and backward and all around at any given time, that it was a fitting metaphor for understanding the plight of deans. Looking forward in terms of providing a vision, walking forward with faculty and staff in a certain direction, for their faculties, but also looking backwards so that they understand what has come before them. What is the context in which they're working? What has been the history of that particular faculty? And of course, that's just looking forward and backward. It's not looking to the sides as well. So the double-sided nature of the Janus effect, I thought, was quite fitting to use in this case. And the final part of the theoretical framework is role conflict, which is again a common sociological term based on role theory. And role theory is, in a nutshell, of course, links individual behavior to social structures. And those social structures can range from the family unit to teams to religious or faith-based groups to faculties and all sorts of other types of social structures as well. And role conflict really reflects the competing and incompatible expectations of the various roles we play. And when you look at the literature, you'll often see role conflict accompanied by the concept of role ambiguity. And this is where roles or the boundaries of roles are not clearly defined. But in this particular study, I didn't look specifically at role ambiguity. And I would argue, given what I've experienced in my life, in my professional life, and what I've read in literature, that role conflict really is a fundamental aspect of not only educational leadership, but also even modern social life. When people talk about being stressed, and we hear that all the time, they're often experiencing a form of role conflict. So my argument is fairly simple. By the very nature of the status that they occupy and the roles associated with that status, the multiple roles that are associated with the status of dean, deans must generate social capital with a wide range of stakeholders, and this leads them to be perceived and even sometimes even feel Janus-faced, which then results in role conflict as they try to juggle competing and incompatible expectations. So a little bit about my participants, instrument, my ethical considerations, the data I used, and a bit about the analysis of the data. I interviewed 19 deans and acting deans who'd served at least 1 year in the roles at a large Western Canadian university. This university not only dealt with the pandemic during the time that we're all familiar with, but also a 6-week faculty strike that was overlaid on top of this just before Omicron raised its head. So it was a very complex, volatile time, to say the least. I conducted semi-structured interviews lasting 90 minutes. Study was approved by our local research ethics board, and all ethical considerations were addressed, particularly issues of confidentiality, which of course would be important for the participants in this case. The interviews resulted in 375 pages of transcript data, and that was accompanied by 60 pages of my own analytic memos. And in this particular part of my research, the data analysis was inductive. I broke the data down into analytic units to begin with, and that eventually led to coding data into 3 related but distinct dimensions. And those 3 dimensions were the networks dimension, the communications dimension, and the human dimension. With respect to networks, here I lay out just 4 of the many multiple networks that deans are a part of. Dean's senior administration and academic staff or faculty, dean's administrative staff or support staff and academic staff, dean's students and academic staff, and deans and external stakeholders. Now, again, these are just 4 of many of the networks that deans, just by virtue of their roles, have to be part of. And some of the themes that arose within this networks dimension was this sense of feeling caught between the concerns of students, caught between the concerns of faculty, for example. Deans in this study talked about the classic sandwich effect. They were always caught in the middle, in other words. Deans talked a lot about how within their units, faculty commonly undervalued the contributions of administrative staff or support staff, and that they spent great amount of effort to make sure that support staff felt valued in spite of how they were treated from time to time. They also talked about attending to both faculty and student concerns at the same time. This is particularly difficult when students would come to complain about an instructor, a faculty member, sometimes tenured, full professor, And then the dean would speak to a professor themselves, and they'd soon realize that oftentimes some of the things that faculty members do actually bring on these concerns. They contribute and exacerbate the concerns of students. So all this to say that deans walk a very difficult line between acknowledging and valuing student feedback and concerns and dealing with them, but also supporting faculty. And faculty are very careful about watching deans walk that tightrope. There are also faculty to faculty conflicts. Sometimes professors don't behave very well, and sometimes they don't get along, just like other people in the world. And the unfortunate part is sometimes those conflicts between people bleed into students, and students become collateral damage in what is really are issues between individual faculty members. And then deans talked in this dimension, talked about dealing with regulatory bodies and accreditation bodies. And this was particularly the case during the pandemic, and particularly the case with deans of professional schools who had to negotiate with these regulatory bodies for students to be able to complete some of their clinical or practicum experience virtually, when normally everything would be done face to face. Those kinds of conversations would have been difficult, and they did take some time, but there was really time was of the essence for both deans and the heads of regulatory bodies to actually make something happen so students could complete their programs. The second dimension is the communications dimension. And here the themes are transparency and confidentiality, information overload versus information vacuum, and optimism and pragmatism. And the first theme, really, transparency and confidentiality, really reflects a major part of the space that deans occupy. Here, deans are exposed to a lot of confidential information, often about individual people, HR issues that are ongoing, initiatives from the university that are in the works, but often they're told that they shouldn't be sharing that. So a lot of this information isn't for public consumption. And sometimes the perception by faculty members in particular is that they're not being totally transparent. Well, in these cases, they simply can't be transparent because they would be breaking confidentiality, and they would hear about it for sure. The next thing has to do with information and the sharing of information. Deans were very clear that during this period of time, the last few years, they became much more attuned to how to customize information to different audiences, to different groups of people, and to be sure not to overload people with too much information at any given time. So, and that sort of leads us into the third theme here, which is through their written communication and through appearing at town halls and other venues, showing that they were supportive of faculty, staff, and students during a difficult time, but also tempering that with the imperative that the work still had to get done. And that was a difficult balance to strike as well. And then the final dimension that I'll talk about today is what I'm referring to as the human dimension. This is where deans look within themselves. And here we have three major themes: limit management, imposter syndrome, and alone in a crowd. With respect to limit management, this is probably one of the most common themes the deans raised with me, and this was the ability to actually manage their day, to close the day when they needed to re-energize, and to make sure their days didn't go on too long, and to have some role in actually managing how those days unfolded. In fact, a couple of people referred to this notion of bandwidth versus commandwidth, and I'm familiar with bandwidth, but not commandwidth. So bandwidth would be, being part of committees and meetings and being a participant, being a member of the committee and expected to engage, but not really being in charge. Commandwidth experiences are where you are chairing the session, whether it's a tenure committee, recruitment committee, a search committee of some kind, just a local curriculum committee within your department or faculty. You need to be responsible for knowing who's around the table, what their particular biases are, what the current issues are, with respect to what you're working on and what the particular sensitivities are. So that requires a different energy level for education leaders like deans. And a couple of deans mentioned to me that what they tried to do is make sure they didn't overload any particular day with too many command width meetings so that it was balanced over the course of the week. The second theme under this dimension is this notion of self-confidence. And a number of deans talked about the imposter syndrome. They said, you know, sometimes I do feel like an imposter, and it's unsettling when other people around you have more confidence in you than you have in yourselves. And of course, this time during the pandemic, the various stages of vaccine and masking mandates, virtual teaching to in-face, and then all the shifts in teaching and learning that occurred during this time, in addition to the faculty strike that I referred to earlier, I think would be unsettling for most leaders. It was a difficult, challenging time. And then the last thing that people mentioned in this, under this particular theme, is this whole notion of struggling alone. And that even though they were surrounded, as deans, you're surrounded by people constantly, all day long, that you actually struggle alone much of the time, and that it's a lonely position. And some people said as you go up the institutional hierarchy, you actually become it becomes lonelier because there are more and more things that you really can't share with other people. And that's the case with even associate deans, that there were times in my particular experience where there were certain issues I couldn't even share with the people that I worked with most closely. So what do the findings suggest about the life of deans, I guess? So the question is, who cares? Why does this matter? So within the networks dimension, I think this study sort of reminds us that deans need to strike a balance between bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. If you spend too much time on the outside building networks with external stakeholders at the expense of what's happening within your faculty, you could be ignoring important emerging issues, for example. And within the communications dimension, I think the lesson there is the greater the number of networks that deans inevitably have to develop, the greater the need to customize communications for different types of audience, whether it's written or it's in spoken form. And then finally, within the human dimension, I would say that the greater the number of networks developed and the greater the social capital generated, the more difficult it will be to set limits for deans and other educational leaders, the more likely the imposter syndrome will kick in, and the more likely it will be to experience loneliness. So, and to conclude, I would just remind everyone, for those of you who are not aware, that there are different interpretations of what it means to be Janus-faced or Janus-faced. One interpretation is that if someone refers to you as being Janus-faced, that you are being duplicitous, you're being deceitful, you're being two-faced, and you can't be trusted. Another interpretation that I prefer, that I think makes more sense in relation to this study, is being sensitive to dualities, polarities, and multiple perspectives on very complicated issues. I think these qualities are really important in our educational leaders, and the participants in this study, by and large, showed me that they do have these qualities, they're aware of them, and they are constantly working at developing strength in these qualities during very volatile and polarized times. So I appreciate your attention this afternoon, and I look forward to any comments that you might have.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Manzik. That was very fascinating. Again, such a unique area of research to focus on deans. I put in the chat, please post your questions. I put Q and Q, it should be Q&A. Just post your questions in the Q&A as we go along. So we have about 30 minutes for questions. So hopefully we'll be able to have quite a robust discussion. But I would like to once again thank you, Emerson, for your presentation, and thank you, David, again. It was they both were very engaging and they really fit well together. We do have one question in the Q&A, so I'll encourage others to please post your questions. Thank you, Behan Fahardi. So I'll read the question out. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned that you were sharing findings. I believe this question is for Emerson, actually. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned that you were sharing findings from semi-structured interviews. I was wondering what data you collected during your additional survey and why you chose this method besides as a recruitment strategy. The second part is, what do you make of the discrepancy in participants between STEM and humanities?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, thank you for the question. I'm excited to answer it. I'm just painfully joined here by my research assistant. So we'll once he's comfortable, I can speak easier. But okay, so the findings from the semi-structured interviews, yes. So the survey was a methodological strategy to try and cast a wide net as possible. I'm sure in David's research as well, there's no good time to interview faculty or deans, right? So this recruitment, I went over numerous cycles of recruitment to try and cast as wide net as possible. So essentially, it was a strategic decision to hear from people who might not be able to contribute to a full interview, but nonetheless might have some interest in contributing some insight. Basically, the types of information that I gleaned from this and then I asked in the survey was about some demographic characteristics to sort of tease out, who are these active users and who are not active users. And I was particularly interested in adding that question about non-users and why they weren't using experiential education, because that's completely absent from the literature. What are the strategic decisions that instructors make? So it was largely to capture who are the people using it, what are their professional standings, because one of my hypotheses was kind of, more likely to be senior instructors than junior instructors, because if you're on the tenure track, potentially you have less time to devote to an advanced style of pedagogy like experiential education. I'm still going back to revisiting the interview or the survey data itself, because the main idea was to get people to the interview to recruit as seamlessly as possible instead of one-on-one reaching out and trying to negotiate with 1,300 individuals. So strategic decision that way. In terms of the discrepancy between STEM and humanities and social science, I mean, there was more commonalities actually than discrepancies. This is a challenge that all these instructors are facing. And I found a high level of common ground of trying to figure this out and sense making across these disciplines. So for example, people from biology had the same challenge as people from English about, in terms of their institution, what counted as experiential education. My hypothesis was that STEM-based disciplines would be able to do this easier than humanities disciplines, because some elements of the discipline might lend itself, such as labs, right? The surprising finding for me was that in a lot of institutions, labs are not counted as experiential learning. Some had, a variety of reasons, but the sort of idea was that, especially in first year courses, the labs don't allow for organic inquiry and uncertainty. They are known outcomes. So they're testing proficiency of students to get to those known outcomes instead of running an experiment where there's an unknown finding at the end or uncovering it on your own. Humanities face similar struggles, right? Where to someone from English, what could be more experiential for our discipline than, writing a short story or acting out narratives, right? But these, by their institutional standards, were not qualified as experiential education. So one of the sort of findings from this is I think we need to broaden our understanding of experiential ed and how it's defined at our institutions, instead of tacking it down to it has to have 10 hours of, and get some of them are quite prescriptive. So maybe a little bit more open-ended could help with that.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Emerson. Great. That was a very interesting, great answer, and very fulsome answer. I have here, okay, this is coming up next. Okay, thank you. The next one in the queue, I have a question for David. It says, in light of your study findings, thank you, Heather, for the question in advance. Question for David. In light of your study findings, what advice do you have for senior administration, or how would you change the university's infrastructure, given that deans are seemingly set up for failure in at least one or more domains? What additional supports are needed for deans to experience success or to help them prioritize between the competing priorities that you outlined? Once again, thanks, Heather, for a great question.
Thanks for the great question, Heather, former grad student, now a faculty member. Super question. Well, I didn't really answer that in this particular study, but many of the deans during these interviews talked about, I did at one point ask them what would be needed in order for you to be able to manage. The study was originally about managing uncertainty and complexity in their roles. And many of them referred to the opportunities to speak to one another more often rather than just in meetings with prescribed agendas, where they actually have an opportunity to talk about the human dimension of the work that they do, the human dimension, the custodial, the sort of emotional toll of the work they do supporting so many people, particularly faculty, staff, and students, and particularly during difficult times. So rather than meeting only when there is already a set agenda with no real time to have meaningful conversations, they talked about how some of them have actually split apart and met on their own informally to actually talk about some of their struggles, so that they didn't experience the loneliness to the same degree that the participants talked about in this study. They also talked about the need for more research into the lives of not just deans, but other people playing different kinds of educational leadership roles at our universities across the country. It's a really untapped source of information. It's a really untapped area for further exploration. And I would encourage some of you to think about that possibility, particularly the people who are known as alt-acs or higher ed professionals, the people who have PhDs but are not in traditional tenure track academic roles. These people, whether they're in admissions departments or in experiential departments or in the provost's office, play incredibly important roles, but the nature of the work they do is poorly understood, and I think they're undervalued. So that would be my response to Heather's question. Thanks again.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for your response, David. I have another question for you from Dr. Pahardi. For David, thanks for your presentation. I appreciate the focus on the human dimension of administration. You mentioned that your interest was in part drawn from your professional experience as an acting dean and dean over a 20-year period. And I wonder how this experience has informed or changed your professional subjectivity. And also to say more about changes in the complexity of the role over time with respect to material constraints and shifts in professional culture and social context. Thank you, Behan, for your question. Dr. Manzik, you are muted.
Sorry. Oh. Yeah, I unmuted myself. Thanks, Alana. Another great question, and something that is really very thought-provoking. The first part of it is you mentioned that you're interested in part drawn from your professional experience. I wonder about this experience has informed or changed your professional subjectivity, and also to say more about the changes in the complexity of the role. Well, I think changes in my subjectivity. I think what I have learned over time is to become more in tune with how other people are experiencing the world, in particular the university at any given time, that how students, particularly marginalized students, or staff, particularly those who are on the sidelines and don't feel they quite fit in, experience our workplace, and making a real effort to draw those folks in. With respect to your question about complexity, I think it has increased. I think the mandates of universities has increased exponentially over the last many years. We just, looking at issues like diversity, Equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization is a huge area, a huge priority for most of our universities. We are much more attuned to mental health issues, not just with students, but everyone, faculty and staff. And deans are expected to be in the middle of all that, to be leading initiatives, to be at least enabling initiatives to sort of take root and actually play out in academic units. So those are just a couple of examples of how our roles have changed. And I think that's one of the reasons why it appears to be more difficult to recruit people into these roles, that it's no longer a role that you should look at as some kind of capstone to your career. It really is probably the ultimate service role, because your life is no longer your own. Your role is to serve others all day long, week in, week out. But there's a real value to be able to be in that position. It's a real privileged position to be able to help people achieve their dreams, whether they're students, staff, or faculty. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for that answer. I appreciate that. I think while we're waiting for additional questions, we do have about 15 minutes more time here. I have a couple questions because I thought both presentations, again, were fantastic. I have a question for you, Emerson. Now, I was really I was captivated by the fact that you talked about the fact that you were teaching like a 300 student intro social class, and so I was interested in what do you think could be done to encourage more buy-in, especially for sessional or contingent faculty members for experiential education, because of the challenges that you mentioned in your research.
Yeah, I think perhaps not so controversially that sessionals, at least my experience of becoming a sessional, you're not really set up for success from the get-go, right? You find out that you're teaching the course maybe a month beforehand. So to authentically do experiential education, like if you think I'm trying to design a community engaged research project, right? That's a year in advance that you need to be brokering those relationships. And the course by course nature doesn't set itself up for authenticity. You might be able to do things like, in my third year research class, for example, I get them to do one interview and one observation assignment. Sometimes you could call that experiential education, but that that course really lends itself to that. For my first year class, yeah, I could get them to go out and do some observations as part of their methods lecture or something like that. But I think the challenge is really timing and awareness of when you're getting the role. So I think one of the things that would incentivize further, not so much at the sessional level, right, but on otherwise, is there is this real contrast about definitions of experiential education. Do we leave them vague institutionally to encourage buy-in? But at the same time, the downside of that is, well, what is it if it's just everything, right? Or if it's just so unprescribed? And on the other end, you could have it more prescriptively, but that runs the risk of excluding existing initiatives that are on campus, right? So one idea that has emerged is let's get some clear language on what are we counting as experiential education. And one that's derived from my master's findings, actually, my master's research was about incentivizing. So instructors saying, yeah, I'm up for tenure and promotion. Am I going to do experiential learning in my class, or am I going to get my book published, right? Or am I going to focus on publications, right? These are the things that are going to get me tenure, not the pedagogy stuff. So ironically, they were the ones, up and coming faculty were the ones saying it's for the experienced people to do. And the experienced people were the ones saying, well, I was never trained in this, so it's for all these young, the young up and coming folks to do, right? So there was sort of like a crisis of confidence in that way. But if it was included more fully in something like a tenure and promotion scheme, where, say, instead of one course, it could count as 2 courses, a lot of institutions are now undergoing tagging procedures. So this course is tagged as an experiential learning course. So maybe for someone teaching that class, that would count as 2 courses instead of 1. Could be one idea to, incentivization from within into an existing system that people already have buy-in to. But the
That's
sessionals was a real challenge, because I did have some sessionals, and they sort of said, like, I do this kind of on my own time, on my own dime, and there's little to no reward or recognition for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to mention that Rebecca, thank you for excellent talks, and was sad to leave. Emerson, what you said just now, I was interested in finding out. I thought of another question, and I was thinking about, did you find a difference between individuals who you interviewed who were in teaching stream positions versus the research stream, like tenure track academic versus the tenure versus the teaching stream positions? Because I don't know if you were able to notice findings in your research between the two streams of tenure track.
Yeah, not so much actually. So people didn't really talk about that. It was just more of their practices. At the time when I was conducting the research, it was more about finding out how they're making sense of it rather than pointing down to particular streams of their profession. So that's why I sort of tease out the distinction between more like seasoned academics, quote unquote, and up and coming ones. But no, so that wasn't something that really came out for me in the findings that I derived.
Interesting. But I think you make a good point about the tenure and promotion and the dilemmas people may, or face, because, we know that publication is valued more. So why, participate in experiential education, if you feel like that's going to be time consuming and take away from your research and writing. So I think that's a really good point that you make. That's a pretty significant piece of your research for teaching and learning in higher education too. Lots of implications there.
I think David has a point that he wants to make.
I just commented that I think this is a crucial point actually that Emerson has raised, and that you just responded to, Alana, is this, if experiential learning is going to be authentic, if we really want it to be authentic as a university or as a faculty, then it's important that we revise our tenure promotion guidelines so it actually acknowledges the important work, just like things like working with Indigenous people in community, or working on internationalization projects. These are, time-consuming, multi-year projects that take a lot of time away from more traditional things that are valued, such as writing books and writing refereed articles. And if it's not acknowledged in tenure promotion guidelines as being an authentic contribution to the work that faculty members are doing, then it's likely that many people won't bother doing them. So I think it's an important point.
And I think as well, considering that, more needs to be done to consider the players in this game, right? If we call it a game. But so, for example, some instructors who did, community engaged learning projects, it's like you have to be very careful about, what is the authentic reason that this is being done? Is it part of an actual community project, or is it being encouraged by the institution that this is one form of learning that we should be doing? Because the risk of that is burnout of community partners, right? The whole idea of community partners is there's a reciprocal benefit to, but more so felt by the community partners. So I had some instructors who talked about, I've been doing this for all these years with this community partner, but now that it's becoming so in vogue, a lot of our partners are burning out because the demands on them are outweighing the benefits to their organization, right? And same with Indigenous studies as well. Many who had long-standing Indigenous partners said that that's a whole nother level of engagement with Indigenous partners.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Emerson and David. That's a very interesting conversation that I think we, has so many implications for many in academia, right? I think what is interesting about what Emerson says is the different levels we have to think about is like contingent faculty and what does this mean for tenure track faculty, and what are the implications for deans and things with that. How about, a lot of deans are also teaching too, so think about that, like all these different complexity of the roles. So we have another question here from Lynn. Lynn would like to appreciative thanks to both presenters. For talk number 1, so that would be Emerson, I'd invite thoughts about conceptualizing student organizations, fecund spaces for experiential social justice and social justice education learning. I guess that's directed to you, Emerson.
I'm just thinking. So certainly when you're thinking about experiential education, the way that it's sometimes broken down is curricular, depending on the model you're looking at. Work integrated learning is under curricular, and then there's this co-curricular elements as well that just sort of rears its head. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, I haven't heard of fecund spaces before. Elena, do you know what those are?
I don't know. David, any ideas?
I think what Lynn means just spaces that would be right for and fertile ground
Right.
for
Okay.
experiential learning. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn.
So one of the things, the first research chapter, I can probably share insight. So the first research chapter just got accepted for publication in Canadian Journal of Higher Ed this morning. So I can send some stuff on this, because what I did was I analyzed the Ontario's strategic funding mandates. And I looked at the 3 generations of those over time to see how has, for a process of institutionalization, how has this played over time? One of the things that has happened is there has been a sort of large expansion of university infrastructure and resources devoted to experiential education. We have to take that with a grain of salt, because what that could mean is that there was just 2 offices that are now 1 office, right? Did anything really change substantively in the organization? No, but now we have this office with a new brand for it. So these spaces definitely are on the rise, and they are mirrored towards the increasing demand for experiential education. So they are on the rise, but from an organizational standpoint, that kind of ceremonial compliance that I was talking about in the presentation is cause for a cautious interpretation of these increases.
All right, thank you, Lynn, for your question. I appreciate that. So Lynn has another question. Let me just get that out of the way there. So for talk number 2, and this would be addressed to David. Thanks again, Lynn, for your question. Talk number 2, here, I'm reading it out here. What possibilities might be imagined for A, a network of deans, presidents, and senior administrators to share, learn, and if need be, organize? B, providing learning preparation, how to be good deans, senior administrators. That could be a title for a book, David. Be a good dean. Learning, getting motivated to work with student organizers as future leaders and voters for a global society. Thank you. These are very thought-provoking questions, Lynn. So David, what do you think?
I'll unmute myself. Well, first of all, with respect to the network of deans, presidents, I think each of these roles is unique. I mean, there's similarities, of course, across these different administrative roles, but there are differences as well. And there are courses, higher ed courses, that people in these roles can take, where you get together with people from other institutions across the country to share information and to share experiences. But a lot of people appreciate having in-house kind of professional development for deans, for example, in particular, because every university has a unique context, unique history, a unique mission, and a unique context. And sometimes when professional development is organized for people across the country, the nuances in terms of context aren't always appreciated, I guess. So I think that would be important. With respect to the second part, providing learning preparation on how to be good deans, I think that's a great suggestion. I think that is a good suggestion, and that's why many universities do have ongoing professional development, lunch hour, brown bag sessions for administrators of different types, where they get to talk about their experiences and the things that they've learned through the challenges that they faced. And the third thing that I would mention is with respect to C, learning, getting motivated to work with student organizers. I think that is really a fecund territory, fertile and untapped opportunities to talk with deans, or to have deans share about how they engage with student groups and how they work towards bringing students into their faculties, into their institutions in authentic and meaningful ways. At town halls, for example, or being responsive to new initiatives proposed by student groups. So thank you for the questions, Lynn.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Lynn, for the questions. And Lynn also adds, let me just archive that question. Lynn also adds that you were correct, David. So you got $800 or $1,000 on the Jeopardy for guessing what fecund is, the word. Definitely fertile. So correct. And Lynn, grateful for responses from both speakers. Lynn, who's a PhD student at U of T. So thank you very much, Lynn. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. David, I had a question for you, actually. I wondered if you had a chance to share your findings at an association meeting of deans, because we know there's the OADE, I think, Association of Deans that exists, and there's a national
Yes.
association of deans. Have
Yeah.
you had a chance to present your research?
Yes, every province has their own deans group. In BC, it's ABCDE, the Association of BC Deans of Education, for example. And in Manitoba, I'm a Dean of Education. It would be the Council of Manitoba Deans of Education. And I have had opportunities to share that. I've shared the results of the first manuscript that was published in the Journal of, can't remember the name of the title now, Australian Journal. I presented those findings this past January to all the deans at my university, and I'm on tap to present at another noon hour session later this year on this second manuscript.
Oh, that's exciting, and congratulations on the manuscript. Yeah. I really think your findings could resonate with a lot of deans, and I think even just interpersonal things around. You're surrounded by people, but lonely because you have other people to share the experiences with. You have other deans, maybe you can at other institutions, but often you're operating in isolation. So I think that's something that probably resonated with a lot of the deans.
Yeah, I think people need to, what they need to take away is that deans are like anybody else. They have burdens that they're carrying. They're struggling behind the scenes like many people are. They're carrying different kinds of burdens. And I think more than anything, we need to cut each other some slack and recognize and remember our shared humanity.
Yeah, that's right. And having empathy for the work of the complex nature of the work as you and just empathy, I think, for deans. I think that's a really good kind of.
And I guess, Alana, now that you mentioned, I guess one of the things that deans could do is invite people into conversations about the complexities. Rather than trying to carry it on one's own, is actually inviting them, talking about why certain issues are more complicated than some faculty members, for example, might think. Actually talking about it, unraveling the different layers so that people get an appreciation of what it is to play these kinds of roles. Nobody wants sympathy, but I mean, I think it helps for just collective understanding of why some of these issues are so complex and why change is so slow at times.
Okay. So I think we're almost out of time now, but I want to thank you so much. Thank you, David and Emerson, for two very engaging presentations. I thought they were really interesting, thought-provoking, and I'm glad that you're publishing this because I'm hoping that more people will get to hear about this. I'd like to, before I turn it over to Sherry, I would like to advertise that our next webinar is going to be in 2024. So I wish everyone a wonderful holiday season. It's going to be Thursday, January 25th at 12 p.m. Dr. Sean Carlton and Ashley Kine will be presenting on residential school denialism, which is a very fascinating topic, and we're really interested in that. We also welcome more proposals to our series, so please email. I'll put my email in the chat if you're interested in submitting another other proposals, because we still have a couple slots open in the new year, and we look forward to that. Over to you, Sherry.